Chapter 5. Elvis sniffed the air wildly. Sabrina could see that he took his guard dog duties seriously. Every little buzz and cracking sound needed to be investigated. The dog darted back and forth, peering through the barbed wire fence that separated the road from the endless forest. Once he was confident that the swaying limbs of the pines or the occasional rooting woodchuck was not a giant sneaking up on them, he trotted to the center of the road and put his huge nose back to work. Sabrina, however, looked down the long, empty road. They'd been walking for over an hour, and not so much as a bicycle had passed them. If they didn't get a ride back to the house soon, they would be walking all night. The time might have passed more quickly if there was a little conversation, but for the last hour, Daphne had marched ahead of Sabrina, refusing to speak. Even Elvis, who followed closely behind, was ignoring her. But since he was a dog, his silence was a lot easier to bear. "How was I supposed to know?" Sabrina cried. "Anybody would have thought she was crazy." "I didn't," Daphne said, finally breaking her silence. "You don't count. You believe everything," Sabrina argued. "And you don't believe anything," the little girl snapped. "Why are we even talking? You don't care what I think anyway." Sabrina wanted to defend herself, but she couldn't come up with words that rang true in her own mind. Daphne was right. What she thought hadn't mattered in a long, long time. But it wasn't like Sabrina wanted it that way. She was only 11 years old, but was forced to act like an adult. It wasn't fun being the grown-up, constantly worrying about whether they were safe and fed and warm. Someone had to make the tough decisions, and unfortunately, she now realized she had never considered what Daphne might want. "Your opinion counts, okay?" Sabrina said. "The old woman—" "Our grandma," Daphne corrected. "Fine, our grandma was just carried off by a giant. We're stuck in the middle of nowhere. I don't have a clue what to do next." "You don't care if we never find them," Daphne said. "Now you can run off like you planned with no one to stop you." Daphne walked to a fallen tree trunk next to the road, sat down, and began to cry. Elvis trotted over and nuzzled her, licking the little girl's tears from her chubby cheeks and adding his whines to her sobbing. Sabrina sat down beside them and put her arm around her sister. "Daphne, we're not running away. It's just that monster was real. We can't fight that by ourselves. Even if we knew where it took them, I don't think we could get them back. What are a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old going to do about a giant?" "You're almost 12, Daphne said, wiping her eyes on the sleeve of her fuzzy orange sweatshirt. "Besides, you heard Granny Relda. We're Grimms, and this is what we do. We take care of fairy tale problems. We'll find a way to save Granny and Mr. Canis." "How?" "With this," Daphne said, holding the old woman's handbag above her head. Sabrina took it from her sister and fumbled through it. Inside were the keyring, the piece of fabric the old woman had claimed came from a giant, a few heavy books, a notepad, and a small photograph. She pulled the last item out. "Mom and Dad," she said as surprise raced through her. It was a picture of their parents, young and in love. Their dad's hand was on their mother's very pregnant belly, and they were both grinning. Granny Relda stood next to them, beaming. A stocky, blonde-haired man had his arm wrapped around her waist. Mr. Canis stood off to the side, as stone-faced as ever. Sabrina held this snapshot as if it were a precious treasure. It was proof that her family existed, that she belonged somewhere. She could see her father's round face mirrored in his mother, and his sunflower blonde hair was a copy of his father's. Daphne had her mother's jet black hair. Sabrina had her high cheekbones and bright eyes. They were all made from the same recipe. Daphne hovered over her sister to get a better look, tears still running down her cheeks. Sabrina turned the picture over. Someone had written, "The family Grimm, Relda, Basil, Henry, Veronica, Mr. Canis, and soon to be born baby Sabrina. "Why did he lie to us?" Sabrina whispered as she tucked the family portrait safely into her pants pocket. "He was trying to protect us," Daphne answered quietly. "And what happens if we start to love Granny and she abandons us too?" the older girl asked, trying to hide the hurt in her voice. "Maybe she won't," Daphne said. "Maybe she'll just love us back, if we ever see her again." The little girl wiped her eyes and dug into Granny Rilda's handbag. She pulled out their grandmother's giant keyring. "She threw this bag out of the car to us. She wants us to have these keys. There has to be something in the house that can help us rescue them." "If we can ever get home," Sabrina said to herself, as a light caught the corner of her eye. She looked down the road. There were headlights approaching. The two girls got up from the log and brushed themselves off. "What should we do? Stick out our thumbs?" Daphne asked. Sabrina didn't know. They'd never hitchhiked before. In the past, whenever the girls had found themselves alone or on the run, they'd slipped under the turnstiles in the subway stations and traveled New York City's subterranean highway. This was new to Sabrina. She stuck out her thumb and Daphne did the same. The car came to a screeching stop. It sat still for a moment, its engine humming, blinding the girls with its high beam light so that they had to shield their eyes with their hands. "Well, that was easy," Daphne said. "What's he doing?" Suddenly, the car let out a long, eardrum rattling honk, followed by more engine revving. To Sabrina, it seemed as if the car were an animal, waiting for the right time to pounce on them. She recalled hearing stories about hitchhikers being killed by lunatics. Hitchhiking didn't seem like a great idea anymore. She grabbed her sister's hand and pulled off the road. As if in response, the car revved its engine again, and the sound of squealing tires on asphalt filled the air. "Run!" Sabrina cried. The two of them raced back the way they had come, hand in hand. Elvis followed closely behind, turning his big head to bark angry warnings at the menacing car. But this had no effect on whoever was behind the wheel. The car veered to the other side of the road, sped up and past the girls, then spun around, leaving black stains on the asphalt and the smell of burning rubber in Sabrina's nose. When it came to an abrupt stop, she realized it was a police car. The door opened and a short, pear-shaped man stepped out. He wore a beige uniform with shiny black boots, a billy club that hung from his utility belt, and a wide-brim hat fastened under his 3 chins. His face was puffy and pink with a nose that angled slightly upward, so that a person could see up his nostrils. On his shirt was a shiny metal star that read, "Ferryport Landing Police Department." A name tag underneath it read, "Sheriff Ernest Hampstead." "Girls, why are you running?" the sheriff asked in an unusually high-pitched voice that made Sabrina shiver. "We thought you were trying to kill us," Daphne said angrily. Sabrina flashed her a look, letting her know that she would do the talking. "I'm sorry if I gave you a start, but it's not safe for little girls like yourselves to be walking out here in the dark. These roads can be treacherous," the sheriff said. "Treacherous?" Daphne asked. "Dangerous," Sabrina explained. "I got a call that you two were out here, so I came looking," the portly man continued as he hoisted his sinking pants up around his waist. "Why don't you two hop into the squad car and I'll take you home?" He pointed to Elvis. "I don't know if we have room for your horse in there, but we'll try." "He's not a horse," Daphne said. Then realizing the sheriff was joking, she added, "You can't tease him. He's very sensitive." Hampstead leaned down and scratched Elvis under the chin. "Oh, I'm sure he is. Aren't you, Elvis?" The big dog growled and snapped at the sheriff's hand. Hampstead pulled it away just in time. "How do you know Elvis?" Sabrina said suspiciously. "Oh, Elvis and I have met many times. You must be Rhoda Grimm's grandchildren. I heard you were in town," he said. "I'm the local sheriff, Ernest Hampstead." "I'm Daphne," the little girl offered. Sabrina muttered, still not sure she could trust him. "So, hop in, unless the two of you want to walk. It's a long way, though. Are you trying to raise $1 million for the March of Dimes?" Hampstead opened the squad car's back door. and Elvis clumsily climbed inside. Sabrina and Daphne walked around the car and got in the front seat. Sheriff Hampstead squeezed and shifted until he was behind the wheel, breathing heavily as if carrying a great burden. As soon as he was settled, he started up the squad car and drove in the direction of Granny's house. "So I assume you two have already concocted a plan?" Hampstead asked. The girls looked at each other, unsure of what to say. "A plan?" Sabrina said, trying to play dumb. "Yes, how are you going to rescue your grandmother and Mr. Canis?" "You know about that?" Sabrina asked, dumbfounded. Sheriff Hampstead shrugged. "Hard to miss a 200-foot giant carrying grandmas away into the night, don't you think? I don't want you two girls to worry. Your granny is a tough cracker. I've seen her in bigger jams than this one. And besides, she's got the entire Ferryport Landing Police Department working on the case. I know you two have been trained for this kind of thing, but we like to take care of our own problems here in Ferryport Landing." Daphne cupped her hand around Sabrina's ear. "Have we been trained?" she whispered. "I don't know what he's talking about," Sabrina whispered back. "Are you an ever after?" the little girl said, returning her attention to the sheriff. The sheriff looked over and winked a yes at Daphne. She squealed in delight. "Which one?" Suddenly, the squad car's two-way radio crackled to life. "Hampstead, Sheriff Hampstead," a man's voice fumed. It sounded oddly familiar to Sabrina. The sheriff nervously grabbed at the handset. His sweaty hand fumbled it before he finally got a hold of it. "I'm here, boss, en route now," Hampstead said. "That's fantastic news, Hampstead. Nice to know you can do something that's asked of you. As for our other problem, our little troublemaker has been arrested, and he's sitting in a cell as we speak." "Good news, sir," Hampstead said. "I'm so glad you approve," the man said. "Now get those little trolls back to the mansion, ASAP. I can't have any more headaches ruining tomorrow's festivities." Sabrina's throat tightened with fear. When she looked at her sister, she saw the same horror reflected in Daphne's eyes. The voice on the police radio belonged to Mayor Charming. "Daphne, do you remember that time Mr. and Mrs. Donovan took us to the 3-day Lima Bean Cook-Off Festival?" Sabrina asked casually, hoping the girl would remember the crazy foster couple they'd lived with for 2 weeks the previous year. The little girl's grimace told her the memory was still fresh and revolting. Mrs. Donovan was so proud of her pickled lima bean casserole, and the girls had been forced to act as taste testers. What Sabrina hoped was that Daphne also remembered their daring escape. Sabrina slipped her hand into her sister's, and when the car slowed to stop at a red light, she quickly pulled on the door handle. Before Hampstead could react, the girls were out of the car and freeing Elvis from the back seat. "Hey!" The sisters ran to the side of the road where the 5-foot barbed wire fence lined the edge of the forest. There was no way to climb it. The fence's sharp teeth would tear them apart. Their only chance was to try to squeeze between the rusty wires to the other side. Sabrina desperately stood on one wire, then reached up and grabbed a safe spot on the next highest one. She pulled it upward with all her strength, creating a hole just big enough for her sister to crawl through. "Go!" she shouted, carefully watching the portly sheriff struggling out of his car. Daphne scurried through the gap, got to her feet, and tried to mimic the trick for her sister. The result was a space Sabrina couldn't possibly squeeze through. "It's heavy," Sabrina coached Daphne. "You have to be strong." "I'm trying," the little girl cried, pulling harder. "Girls, get back into the car," Hampstead shouted angrily as he finally freed himself. He charged forward, but Elvis positioned himself, his humongous body, between the girls and the sheriff, and growled until the man froze in his steps. "Hurry," Daphne begged. "I can't hold it much longer." Sabrina got down on her hands and knees and tried to shimmy through the opening. She was nearly halfway through when Hampstead, dodging Elvis, grabbed her legs. "You're coming with me," he grunted as he tried to pull her back. Sabrina kicked wildly, landing a couple painful blows to the man's chest and belly. He squealed in protest, making noises Sabrina had never heard come from a human being. When she looked back, into the sheriff's face, what she saw bewildered her. Sheriff Hampstead was going through a disturbing metamorphosis. His pug nose became a slimy pink snout. His round face puffed up to 3 times its size, and his ears turned pointy and migrated to the top of his head. His chubby fingers melded into thick black hoofs, and his back bent over until he was literally on all fours. Hampstead turned into a pig, an angry, determined pig in a policeman's uniform. Sabrina kicked once more and felt her foot sink into the pig's gelatinous belly. His face turned white and he fell onto his back, honking and gasping for air as his little legs flailed back and forth. Just as suddenly, he changed back into a man and struggled to his feet. Just then, Daphne's arms gave out and the barbed wire came down on top of Sabrina, snagging her pants. Daphne tried to lift it again, but the taut wire barely moved. Sabrina was trapped. "Daphne, just go without me," Sabrina cried, but the little girl shook her head in refusal. Suddenly, she heard a series of notes, as if someone in the woods was playing a flute, followed by a buzzing sound that grew louder and louder. She peered through the trees nervously, remembering the music from the night before. "They're coming, aren't they?" Daphne asked, just as a swarm of little lights zipped out of the forest surrounded them. This time, the lights didn't attack. Instead, they hovered above them, as if waiting for instructions. A single note pierced the night air, and the lights zipped into action, perching on the barbed wires that bit into Sabrina's pants, and with a flutter of tiny wings, pushed at the lowest wire, creating a hole big enough for Sabrina to crawl through. Sabrina wasn't sure if she could trust the flying menaces, especially after her last encounter. But Hampstead was marching toward her, so she freed herself from the top wire and crawled through as quickly as she could. The lights didn't release the fence until she was safely on the other side. Hampstead stomped his foot in frustration, then ran up and down the length of the fence, searching for an opening big enough for his body. Desperately, he got onto his hands and knees and tried to squeeze through an impossibly small hole. That's when Elvis made his move. The big dog, a runaway fur-covered train, ran full steam right at Hampstead and leaped into the sheriff's broad back. Using it as a springboard, the dog sailed effortlessly to the other side of the fence. The chubby policeman let out an oof, but quickly recovered. He stood up, grabbed a fence post, and began to climb, rung by rung. Sabrina knew she had to act quickly. She grabbed another post, and discovering it was quite loose in the ground, she shook it back and forth as hard as she could. The fence swayed uncontrollably, and the sheriff swayed with it. "Hey, stop that!" Hampstead shouted nervously as he clung to the post. Daphne rushed to Sabrina's side, and together they shook the fence even harder. Suddenly, with a loud tearing of fabric, Sheriff Hampstead thumped to the ground on his side of the fence. He groaned and let out an angry cry. After a moment, he picked himself up, only to discover his pants had not survived the fall. They hung from the barbed wire's sharp teeth, leaving the sheriff in only a pair of droopy long johns. Defeated, he hobbled back to his car. "He turned into a pig," Daphne whispered, still shaken from the experience. "I saw him," Sabrina replied, then gestured behind them. "But I think we have another problem." The little lights waited patiently nearby. They darted into the woods and then came back out as if they wanted the girls to follow them. "What do you want?" Sabrina asked, feeling slightly foolish for talking to insects, even after they shimmered and blinked in answer. "I think they want us to follow them," said Daphne. "I don't see we've got much of a choice," Sabrina said, knowing the lights might attack if they didn't. She took her sister's hand and they walked into the dark woods with Elvis trotting closely behind. Low-hanging branches blocked their path, and each step required the girls to dodge and weave to get through. Several times, Sabrina walked right into trees, but the lights patiently guided them, always showing down to let them catch up. Always slowing down to let them catch up. Soon the girls stepped into a clearing. In the center was a pile of junk, not nearly as large as the one on Applebee's farm, and arranged in the shape of a massive chair. Sitting on this junk throne was a boy. He had a mop of blonde hair that was tousled and dirty. He wore a pair of baggy blue jeans and a green hooded sweatshirt in desperate need of washing. He held a small wooden sword in one hand, and perched on his head was a golden crown. "Minions," he called to the little lights, "what have you found?" The pixies erupted into loud buzzing. "Spies, you say?" the boy asked. "Well, what do we do with spies?" There was more buzzing in response, and a wicked grin stretched across the boy's dirty face. "That's correct," he laughed. "We drown them."